The radar screen erupted in green blips, dozens of them racing toward us at 30 knots. I pressed my face closer to the scope aboard the USS Gambier Bay, my hands trembling as I counted the contacts. 23 enemy ships, battleships, heavy cruisers, destroyers. The entire Japanese center force, led by the monster battleship Yamato herself, bearing down on our little task unit like wolves on scattered sheep, whispered radioman third class Jimmy Torres beside me. That's the whole Japanese fleet. I keyed the intercom with shaking fingers. Bridge, CIC. Multiple surface contacts bearing 040, range 25 miles and closing fast. Count 23 enemy vessels, including what appears to be battleships. The silence that followed felt like eternity. Then came Admiral Sprague's voice over the TBS radio, calm as if he were ordering coffee. All units, this is Ziggy. We are under attack by Japanese surface forces. All ships make smoke and prepare for surface action. My name is Seaman First Class Robert Bobby McKenzie, and October 25, 1944 was supposed to be just another patrol day off the Philippines. Instead, it became the morning when 6 escort carriers, 3 destroyers, and 4 destroyer escorts faced off against the most powerful naval force Japan had left and somehow lived to tell about it. The story begins 3 days earlier when Task Unit 77.4, 3, call sign Taffy 3, took our position off Samar Island. We weren't much to look at. 6 baby flattops converted from merchant hulls, escorted by 7 tin cans that barely displaced 2,500 tons each. Our carriers launched Wildcats and Avengers for close air support, not fleet battles. Our destroyers carried 5-inch popguns meant for submarine hunting, not slugging it out with battleships. But Admiral Clifton Ziggy Sprague didn't pick his nickname for nothing. The man had survived everything the Navy could throw at him, from submarine attacks to kamikaze raids, and he wasn't about to let some Japanese task force ruin his morning. When To's radar contacts first appeared, I was in the Combat Information Center of Gambier Bay, plotting airstrikes against Japanese positions on Lake. The CIC was cramped, hot, and smelled like coffee, cigarettes, and fierce sweat. Banks of radar equipment lined the bulkheads, their green screens casting an eerie glow over our faces as we tracked friendly aircraft returning from dawn patrol. Then radar operator second class Danny Kowalski called out the contact that changed everything. CIC, I've got surface contacts bearing northeast, range 30 miles. Big ones. Moving fast. I scrambled over to his scope. The blips were huge, much larger than our own ship's signatures, and they were moving in perfect formation, straight toward us. Count 'em up, Mac, Kowalski muttered, his Chicago accent thick with tension. I started marking contacts with a greased pencil. 4, 8, 12, 16, 23 total. The formation looked like a textbook surface engagement force. Heavy units in the center, screening vessels on the flanks, destroyers racing ahead. Bridge, CIC, I called over the intercom. We have multiple large surface contacts approaching from the northeast. Recommend immediate course change in preparation for. The general quarters alarm cut me off. Its harsh klaxon shattered the morning calm as sailors throughout the ship raced to battle stations. Within minutes, Gambier Bay came alive with the controlled chaos of a warship preparing for action. From the bridge came Captain Hugh Goodwin's voice. All hands, this is the captain. We are under attack by Japanese surface forces, including battleships and heavy cruisers. We will launch all available aircraft immediately and take evasive action. This is not a drill. Through the CIC's small porthole, I could see our destroyers already making smoke, their stacks belching thick black clouds that began to obscure the horizon. The USS Hoel, Heermann, and Samuel B. Roberts were turning toward the enemy, 3 small ships charging headlong at a force that outgunned them by 20 to 1. Those crazy bastards are going straight at 'em, Torres breathed. And they were. While we escort carriers turned southeast and began launching every aircraft we had, our destroyer escorts were steaming north at flank speed, laying smoke and preparing for a torpedo attack that everyone knew was suicide. The first enemy shells arrived at 0658 hours. I felt them before I heard them, a deep earth-shaking rumble that seemed to come from the ocean itself. Then came the sound, a freight train roaring overhead, followed by towering waterspouts that rose like white mountains around our formation. The Japanese were firing from 18 miles away. Their 18 1-inch guns from Yamato and 14-inch rifles from Kongo and Haruna could reach us long before our 5-inch popguns could even dream of hitting back. Each enemy salvo threw up geysers taller than our masts, some colored red, others green. The Japanese were using dye loads to track their fall of shot. "Straddle on Kongo Bay," called the lookout. "She's taking near misses." From my position in the CIC, I could track the developing battle through radar returns and radio chatter. Our carriers were running southeast at their maximum speed, 18 knots for the old converted merchantmen, while launching every aircraft they could get airborne. Wildcats, Avengers, even cargo planes were taking off with whatever ordnance they could carry. The destroyer USS Hoel, commanded by Commander Leon Kindberger, was the first to press home her attack. Through the radio chatter, I could hear her communications as she charged straight at the Japanese battle line. "Control, this is Hoel. We are engaging enemy heavy cruiser Haguro. Launching torpedoes." From 18,000 yards, Hoel fired a full spread of 10 torpedoes at the massive heavy cruiser, then turned to bring her after troops to bear. The Japanese response was immediate and devastating. Haguro, Chokai, and several destroyers concentrated their fire on the lone American destroyer, straddling her with salvo after salvo of 8-inch shells. Hoel reports hits forward and aft. Came the report over the radio, "She's still fighting." Through binoculars from Gambier Bay's bridge wing, I watched Hoel disappear into her own smoke, her guns still firing. She had closed to within 5 miles of the Japanese formation, point-blank range for her 5-inch guns. For 35 minutes, she dueled with cruisers that each mounted more firepower than her entire armament. Then came the report we all dreaded. Hoel is dead in the water. She's listing heavily to port. But Commander Kindberger wasn't finished. Even with his ship crippled and burning, Hoel continued to fire at the advancing Japanese ships. Her afterguns kept shooting until the very end, when enemy shells finally found her magazine. The explosion lit up the dawn like a miniature sun. While Hoel was making her heroic stand, the other destroyers weren't idle. USS Heermann, under Lieutenant Commander Amos Hathaway, had circled around to attack from a different angle. Her target was the massive battleship Haruna, 35,000 tons of steel bristling with 14-inch guns. "This is Heermann," came Hathaway's voice over the radio, calm as if he were ordering lunch. Launching fish at the lead battleship. Heermann fired a full spread of torpedoes at Haruna from 10,000 yards, then turned to avoid the return fire. But the Japanese battleship's secondary battery, 26-inch guns, opened up on the small destroyer with a fury that shook the ocean itself. From the CIC, I could hear the impact of shells hitting Heermann's hull, a metallic ringing that carried across the water despite the distance. But somehow, miraculously, she kept fighting. Heermann reports 3 hits, came the damage report. Fire in the after engine room, but she's still making turns. The most incredible attack came from the destroyer escort USS Samuel B. Roberts, the Sammy B. At 1,350 tons, she was barely half the size of a full destroyer, armed with only 2 5-inch guns and 3 torpedo tubes. But Lieutenant Commander Robert Copeland had decided that if his ship was going to die, she would die fighting. "This is Roberts," Copeland announced over the radio. "We're going after that heavy cruiser. All guns, commence firing." The Sammy B charged straight at the heavy cruiser Chokai, firing her 5-inch guns as fast as her crew could load them. At maximum elevation, those guns could barely reach the enemy cruiser, but Copeland's gunners kept shooting anyway, walking their shells across the water toward the massive enemy ship. For 20 minutes, Samuel B. Roberts slugged it out with Chokai, a David and Goliath battle that defied all logic. The little destroyer escort's guns were firing so fast that their paint began to peel from the heat. Her crew passed ammunition by hand when the mechanical hoist failed, maintaining a rate of fire that amazed even veteran gunners. Then Roberts did the impossible. She scored hits on Chokai. Roberts reports hits on the enemy cruiser. Came the excited radio call. Heavy smoke and fire visible from the target. But the Japanese response was swift and overwhelming. Chokai, Chikuma, and Tone all turned their guns on the small destroyer escort. Within minutes, Samuel B. Roberts was being hammered by 8-inch shells that tore through her thin hull like paper. Roberts is hit bad, came the report. Major flooding in the engine room. She's losing power. Yet even as she died, the Sammy B kept fighting. Her crew continued to fire her forward 5-inch gun manually, training it by hand when power failed, loading shells from the ready magazine even as seawater poured into her hull. She fought until the very end, her guns blazing defiance at an enemy force that outweighed her by hundreds of thousands of tons. Aboard Gambier Bay, we weren't just watching the destroyer's sacrifice, we were fighting for our own lives. The Japanese battleships and heavy cruisers had Closetto within 16,000 yards, and their fire was becoming devastatingly accurate. Colored waterspouts from enemy shells rose all around us, some so close they showered our flight deck with seawater and shell splinters. Near miss, port side, called the lookout. Another one, starboard quarter. Captain Goodwin was handling the ship like a destroyer, throwing Gambier Bay into radical turns every time he saw muzzled flashes on the horizon. Our old merchant hull groaned and protested as we heeled over in emergency turns, but somehow we kept dodging the incoming shells. From the CIC, I could track the positions of all 6 carriers as they zigzagged through the rain of Japanese fire. Callanan Bay was taking near misses that rattled her frames. St. Lo was barely visible through the smoke and spray from enemy shells. White Plains, Fanshawe Bay, and Kitkin Bay were all under fire, all dodging and weaving like destroyers instead of flat-deck carriers. But our real salvation was coming from the air. Every carrier in Taffy 3 had launched every aircraft she could get airborne. Wildcats, Avengers, even utility planes were racing toward the Japanese formation, armed with whatever ordnance they could carry, bombs, torpedoes, depth charges, even machine gun ammunition. Lieutenant Commander Bill Brooks, leading a squadron of Avengers from Gambier Bay, was making attack runs on the Japanese heavy cruisers despite having no armor-piercing bombs, only general-purpose ordnance meant for ground targets. "This is Broiler Base Leader," came Brooks's voice over the radio. "We're going in on the lead cruiser. These GP bombs might not penetrate, but we'll give them something to think about." The Avengers dove through a storm of anti-aircraft fire that turned the sky black with exploding shells. Japanese cruisers threw up a curtain of flak so thick it looked solid, but the torpedo bombers kept coming, pressing their attacks to point-blank range. "Hit on the lead cruiser," called one of the pilots. Big explosion amidships. The heavy cruiser Suzuya had taken a direct hit from an Avenger's 500-pound bomb. While the general-purpose ordnance couldn't penetrate her armor, it started fires on her superstructure and killed dozens of her anti-aircraft gunners. More importantly, it forced the Japanese ships to split their attention between surface action and air defense, exactly what we needed to survive. The turning point came at 0830 hours, when the Japanese made a fatal tactical error. Admiral Kurita, commanding the center force from the battleship Yamato, was convinced he was fighting a task force of fast fleet carriers protected by heavy cruisers, not a handful of escort carriers defended by destroyers. The fierce resistance from our destroyers, the constant air attacks, and the confusion of battle had led him to overestimate our strength dramatically. When his ships finally closed to within 10,000 yards of our formation, close enough that their guns couldn't miss, Kurita made the decision that saved Taffy 3. He ordered his ships to turn north and withdraw. CIC bridge, came Captain Goodwin's voice over the intercom. The enemy formation is turning away. They're breaking off action. From the radar scope, I watched in amazement as the massive enemy contacts began to turn away from us. The Japanese ships that had been closing in for the kill were suddenly heading north, back toward their own waters. "I don't believe it," whispered Torres. "They're running." But our victory came at a terrible price. Of our 7 escort ships, 3 were gone. USS Hoel had sunk after her heroic charge, taking 253 of her crew with her. USS Samuel B. Roberts went down still fighting. 89 of her sailors lost in the cold Pacific waters. USS Johnston, which had made her own epic torpedo attack, was also on the bottom, along with 186 of her crew. Gambier Bay herself was dying. Enemy shells had found our engine room, and we were losing power fast. Black smoke poured from our stack as our engineering crew fought to keep us moving, but it was a losing battle. "All hands, this is the captain," came Goodwin's voice. "Prepare to abandon ship. We've done our job. Now it's time to save ourselves." I spent the next 6 hours in the water, floating in my life jacket alongside 400 other survivors from Gambier Bay. The Pacific was warm, but not warm enough to prevent hypothermia from setting in after hours of immersion. Men around me were crying, praying, calling for their mothers, and dying. Japanese destroyers had circled back to finish off our crippled ships, but something remarkable happened. Instead of machine gunning us in the water, a common practice earlier in the war, several Japanese sailors threw life preservers and medical supplies to our survivors. One destroyer captain even saluted our sinking carrier as she went down. Later, I would learn that Captain Tamechi Hira of the destroyer Shiger had been so impressed by our destroyer's courage that he ordered his crew to treat our survivors with honor. The samurai spirit recognized itself, even in an enemy. We were rescued 36 hours later by American destroyers, sunburned, dehydrated, and half dead from exposure. Off Gambier Bay's crew of 860 men, 147 were lost, either killed in the battle or died in the water afterward. But we had won. The battle off Samar, as historians would later call it, was the last time Japanese battleships would threaten American forces. Kurita's center force, bloodied and confused by our resistance, never reached the invasion beaches at Lake Gulf. The Japanese Navy's final gamble had failed, broken against the courage of sailors and airmen who refused to yield. 50 years later, I can still see Commander Leon Kinberger's face as he stood on Hoel's Bridge, steering his destroyer into a hail of 14-inch shells. I can still hear Lieutenant Commander Robert Copeland's voice as he ordered Samuel B. Roberts to charge a heavy cruiser 10 times her size. I can still feel the deck of Gambier Bay shuddering under my feet as enemy shells bracketed us with colored waterspouts. The Japanese called it a divine wind, kamikaze, when they sacrificed themselves for their emperor. But on October 25, 1944, off the coast of Samar, it was American sailors who showed the world what sacrifice truly meant. We were ordinary men, farm boys from Iowa, factory workers from Detroit, clerks from New York City. Most of us had never seen the ocean before Pearl Harbor dragged us into the war. But when the moment came, when everything depended on our courage, we stood our ground against the most powerful naval force Japan had left. 3 destroyers and 4 destroyer escorts, supported by 6 escort carriers that were never meant to fight surface battles, had defeated a force that included 4 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 11 destroyers. The Japanese lost 3 heavy cruisers sunk, several more damaged, and most importantly, they lost their last chance to change the course of the war. Admiral Sprague summed it up best in his action report. The failure of the enemy to completely wipe out all vessels of this task unit can be attributed to our successful smoke screen. Our torpedo attacks, continuous harassment of the enemy by bomb, torpedo, and strafing air attacks, timely maneuvers, and the definite partiality of Almighty God. I preferred to think it was something simpler. American sailors doing their job, no matter the odds. The ghosts of Hoel, Samuel B, Roberts, and Johnston still sail those waters off Samar, their crews forever young, forever brave, forever standing watch between the darkness and the light. They remind us that sometimes, when everything is on the line, ordinary people can do extraordinary things. That's the lesson of Taffy 3. Not that war is glorious, but that courage is contagious. When one man stands, others stand with him. When one ship charges into impossible odds, others follow. When the choice comes between running and fighting, between surrender and sacrifice, Americans choose to fight. We always choose to fight. As I write these words in my kitchen in Kansas, surrounded by grandchildren who will never know the terror of enemy shells or the brotherhood of men facing death together, I think about the price of the freedom they take for granted. It was paid in places like Samar by young men who went to sea in tin cans and baby flattops, who faced the steel and fire of the Imperial Japanese Navy and said, simply, not today, and not ever. That's what we did on October 25, 1944. That's what Taffy 3 achieved in the waters off Samar Island. We stood against the darkness, and the darkness broke against us like waves against a seawall. And in the end, that's all any of us can do. Stand our watch, do our duty, and trust that somewhere, somehow, it makes a difference. It did make a difference. The invasion beaches at Leyte were safe. MacArthur returned to the Philippines as promised. The war moved one step closer to its end. And 3 small destroyers, 4 smaller destroyer escorts, and 6 escort carriers that were never supposed to fight battleships wrote their names in history with smoke and steel, courage and sacrifice. We were Taffy 3. We were ordinary Americans doing extraordinary things, and we were enough.